Tab 1 One morning in early June of 2011 in the beautiful and historic Russian city of Kazan, which is situated along the banks of the Volga and Kazanka rivers, a 49-year-old woman named Filu Mamedov woke up feeling terribly nauseous and weak. The weather outside was just beginning to warm up, but inside her apartment, Filu felt a cold, deep chill. For several months, Filu had been dealing with some pretty serious health problems that had been a constant source of worry for her and her family. Her doctors had run a series of medical tests, checked her blood pressure, and ultimately gave her some very clear instructions on how she needed to live her daily life. They told her that she absolutely had to take things easy. She needed to avoid anything that caused her stress, she should not get angry, she should not lift heavy objects, and she basically just needed to relax and keep her heart rate down as much as possible. So, on this particular morning, when she woke up with that heavy, sick feeling in her stomach and a slight dizziness in her head, Filu decided to listen to her doctors. Instead of forcing herself to get dressed, put on her coat, and push through the physical discomfort to go to work, she decided she would call in sick. She thought she would just stay home, make herself a warm cup of herbal tea, and try to rest in bed until she felt better. But a little while later, as Filu was standing in her kitchen waiting for the water to boil on the stove, her husband Fili walked into the room. They had been happily married for nearly 30 years, and he was always very attentive to her health and tried to help her whenever he could. He looked at her pale face and asked how she was holding up. Filu looked back at him, held her hand over her stomach, and sighed. She told him that she actually felt much worse than before. The nausea had not gone away, and now her chest was starting to feel tight and she was beginning to sweat. She told Fili that she was going to go lie down in the bedroom and see if that helped her recover. But as Filu took her first few steps across the linoleum kitchen floor, her chest suddenly tightened tenfold. The pain was sharp, heavy, and overwhelming, and before she could even call out to her husband or reach for the counter to steady herself, her eyes rolled back and she collapsed heavily onto the hard floor, completely unconscious. Fili let out a loud shout of terror and rushed over to her side. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulders and calling her name, but she was totally unresponsive and her body was completely limp. Panic setting in, he scrambled to the phone, his hands shaking so much he could barely press the buttons, and dialed 112, which is Russia's emergency service line. He frantically explained to the operator that his wife had collapsed in the kitchen and was not breathing. Within minutes, the loud wailing sirens of a city ambulance echoed down the narrow street, and the vehicle quickly arrived at their apartment home. The paramedics rushed inside with their medical kits, but when they checked Filu, she had no pulse and her skin was cold. They quickly loaded her onto a stretcher and rushed her to the hospital, performing emergency life support procedures along the way in a desperate bid to save her. But by the time they arrived at the medical facility, it was too late. The emergency room doctors officially declared Filu dead, stating that she had suffered a massive and fatal heart attack. Fili was absolutely devastated, completely broken by the sudden loss. He had lost his partner of nearly 3 decades in the blink of an eye, and the house felt empty and quiet. But according to their religious traditions, a deceased loved one should be buried as quickly as possible, ideally within 24 hours of their passing. This meant that despite being completely consumed by grief and barely able to think straight, Fili had to act immediately. He spent the rest of that tragic day on the phone calling relatives, informing friends, and making rapid arrangements with a local funeral home for Filu's service, which was scheduled to take place the very next morning. He hardly slept at all that night, sitting in the dark and wondering how he was going to go on without her. The next day, Fili woke up in their silent home, put on his best suit, and drove to the funeral home to prepare for the service. When he walked inside the chapel, the reality of the situation hit him all over again. The room was filled with rows of simple wooden chairs, all facing the front. At the front of the room, resting on a sturdy table, was his wife's coffin. It was an open casket service, and the casket was surrounded by a modest arrangement of flowers. Fili and his wife did not have much money, and he had spent almost everything he had just to secure those few flowers and the basic service itself. Fili slowly walked down the center aisle toward the coffin, his steps heavy with sorrow. The gathered family and friends saw him approaching and quietly stepped aside, bowing their heads to give him space out of respect. When Fili reached the edge of the casket and looked down at his wife, he was immediately struck by how strange she looked. Because they had so little money, Fili had not been able to pay for the expensive embalming process, which is the chemical method used to preserve a body and make it look natural for a viewing. Instead, the staff at the funeral home had tried to compensate by applying heavy cosmetic makeup to Filu's face to cover her pale complexion, but they had gone completely overboard. Filu had never worn makeup in her entire life. So, seeing her lying there with thick eyeliner and bright red lipstick looked totally unnatural to him. It did not even look like his wife, and it made him feel highly uncomfortable and confused. Behind Fili, the first row of mourners, including his mother and brother, began to recite the traditional prayers for the dead, their voices low and rhythmic. Feely took one last, painful look at his wife's unfamiliar face, then stepped back to join his family in the front row. He stood between his mother and his brother, holding their hands tightly as they prayed. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming grief and focus entirely on the words of the prayer, but then the quiet, somber atmosphere of the room was shattered. On his right, Feely felt his mother's hand begin to tremble violently. She suddenly stopped praying and let out a strange, choked gasp. Feely opened his eyes and turned to look at her, fully expecting that she was about to collapse from the emotional strain of the day. But his mother was not looking down at the floor. She was standing completely frozen, her eyes wide with terror, staring directly at the front of the room where the coffin sat. Feely followed her gaze toward the coffin, and what he saw made his heart stop. His wife, Philou, was sitting straight up in her casket. She was not making a single sound, but her eyes were wide open, staring out at the room full of mourners. The heavy, dark makeup on her face made her look incredibly eerie as she sat there, completely motionless, just looking at the crowd of people who had gathered to bury her. For a long, agonizing second, the entire room went completely silent. Nobody moved and nobody breathed. The mourners and the woman in the coffin just stared at each other in sheer disbelief and horror. Then Philou began to scream. At first, no sound came out of her mouth. It was just a dry, raspy wheeze as she struggled to get air into her lungs. But then her chest rose and she let out a loud, guttural bellow that echoed off the walls. The moment that deep, terrifying sound broke the silence, the crowd erupted into absolute chaos. People began screaming in terror, tripping over the wooden chairs as they scrambled to get away from the front of the room. The funeral home staff, completely bewildered and terrified, rushed to the phones to call the emergency services again, having no idea what else to do in this impossible situation. Feely, who had also been frozen in shock and screaming, suddenly snapped out of his trance. He realized this was his wife, and she was alive. He ran up to the coffin, reached in, and threw his arms around her, holding her tight. As soon as Feely embraced her, Philou stopped screaming. She looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, tears streaming down her face and smearing the heavy mascara and lipstick. She began to sob quietly, and then her body suddenly went limp and she slumped forward into her husband's arms. Seeing this, the family members realized she was alive and they rushed forward to help. Together, they gently lifted Philou out of the casket and laid her down on the carpeted floor. Though she was no longer moving or speaking, her eyes remained open, staring up at them in absolute terror as she wept. 12 minutes later, a second ambulance arrived and the paramedics rushed Philou straight back to the hospital. But tragically, shortly after they arrived, she was declared dead for the second time. It would later turn out that when Philou had collapsed on her kitchen floor the day before, she had indeed suffered a serious heart attack. However, it had not actually killed her. Instead, she had fallen into a state of deep unconsciousness, and her breathing had become so shallow and faint that the doctors and paramedics had failed to detect it. But when Philou suddenly regained consciousness inside her own coffin and looked around to see her family mourning her at her own funeral, the sheer terror and psychological shock of the realization proved to be too much for her fragile heart. The immense stress triggered a second massive heart attack, and this one was truly fatal. Now our next story takes us to the autumn of 2003, and it begins with a young, newlywed couple who were embarking on what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. On October 15, 2003, 26-year-old Tina Watson and her husband, 26-year-old Gabe Watson, arrived in Australia for their honeymoon. The young couple lived in the state of Alabama, and neither of them made very much money at their respective jobs. Tina worked in the children's department of a local clothing store in town, and Gabe worked for his father's industrial packaging company. Because of their modest incomes, they never could have afforded a trip like this on their own. But Gabe's family had generously gifted them the entire honeymoon to Australia as a wedding present. Gabe and Tina were absolutely thrilled, and they had spent an entire year planning out every single detail of the trip. They wanted to make sure they got to experience everything that this beautiful, distant country had to offer. Once they arrived in Australia, they spent their first week in the bustling city of Sydney. They did all the classic tourist activities, going on a scenic river cruise down the harbor, visiting the world-famous Sydney Opera House, and heading to the local zoo so Tina could see the koalas, which she was incredibly excited about because she had a deep and lifelong love for animals. For those first 6 days, everything was absolutely perfect. They took photos, held hands as they walked through the city streets, and remarked to each other about how lucky they were to be experiencing all of this together. Then, on October 21st, the couple traveled north to the coastal town of Townsville. Townsville is a beautiful destination located right next to the Great Barrier Reef, which is the largest and most famous coral reef system in the entire world. This portion of the trip was meant to be the absolute highlight of their honeymoon, and they had been looking forward to it for months. Gabe had grown up with a passion for the water, and as an adult, he had become an avid scuba diver. He had even gone through extensive training back in the United States to become a certified rescue diver. Back home in Alabama, he would jump at any opportunity to go diving in local lakes and quarries. Tina, on the other hand, was quite intimidated by the ocean. The thought of being deep underwater for long periods of time, relying entirely on a mechanical tank for oxygen, made her very anxious. It felt completely unnatural and foreign to her, and she was terrified of the idea of losing her breath while submerged. But she knew how much Gabe loved diving, and she wanted more than anything to share this passion with him during their honeymoon in one of the most famous diving spots in the world. So, 10 months earlier, in January of 2003, Tina had courageously signed up for professional scuba lessons. She worked hard, overcame her fears, and managed to get her official diving certification just before they left for Australia. After arriving in Townsville, the couple spent the night at a local hotel, and early the next morning, they headed down to the docks. There, they boarded a commercial diving boat that was scheduled to take a small group of tourists out to a famous diving spot known as the Yongala shipwreck. The Yongala was a historic passenger ship that sank during a massive storm in 1911, and the wreck now sat on the ocean floor, surrounded by vibrant marine life near the Great Barrier Reef. As the boat sailed out into the open ocean, the weather was perfect. The water was a brilliant, crystal-clear blue, and you could see schools of colorful fish swimming just beneath the surface. When the boat finally anchored directly above the shipwreck, Gabe and Tina, along with 4 other tourists, began putting on their heavy diving gear. Because safety is paramount in scuba diving, Gabe and Tina were designated as dive partners, meaning they were strictly instructed to stay close to each other at all times and never separate under any circumstances. Once everyone was ready, the divers jumped into the water. Together with the rest of the group, Gabe and Tina began their slow descent down to the ocean floor, which was about 100 feet below the surface. At first, everything went smoothly. The water was incredibly clear and the sunlight filtered down, illuminating the massive shipwreck. It was a breathtaking sight. But as they swam around, Gabe looked down at his wrist and noticed that his dive computer, a critical piece of gear that monitors a diver's depth, time, and oxygen levels, was malfunctioning. Gabe signaled to Tina that they needed to head back up to the surface so he could get the computer sorted out. Together, they swam back up to the boat where Gabe spoke with the dive leader. Within a couple of minutes, the issue was resolved, and Gabe and Tina put their regulators back in their mouths and submerged once again, swimming back down toward the shipwreck to rejoin the rest of the group. As they approached the wreck, they could see the other pairs of divers swimming peacefully around the massive underwater structure. Gabe and Tina joined the group and began exploring. Back on the surface, the dive leader was sitting on the boat, keeping watch. But just 5 minutes after Gabe and Tina had gone back down, the dive leader noticed a sudden, violent eruption of air bubbles breaking the surface of the water near the boat. He leaned over the side to see what was happening, and suddenly, Gabe came blasting out of the water, gasping for air. The dive leader immediately noticed that Tina was not with him. Gabe was in a state of sheer panic. He ripped off his diving mask and began screaming to the dive leader that something terrible was happening. He said that his wife had panicked, that she had started sinking away from him, and that he could not get to her. He begged for help. The dive leader did not hesitate. He quickly strapped on a scuba tank, grabbed his gear, and plunged into the water, swimming down as fast as he physically could. When he reached the bottom near the shipwreck, he spotted Tina. She was lying flat on her back on the sandy ocean floor, completely motionless. Her regulator was out of her mouth. The dive leader swam to her, scooped her up, and swam back to the surface as fast as safety limits allowed. He hauled her onto the deck of the boat and immediately began performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation. For 45 agonizing minutes, the dive leader and the crew tried everything they could to revive Tina, but she never regained consciousness. She was pronounced dead. An autopsy later revealed that Tina had died from an air embolism. This occurs when an air bubble enters a blood vessel and blocks the flow of blood, which can happen if a diver panics, holds their breath, or ascends too rapidly. Based on Gabe's initial account, investigators initially formulated a theory of what had happened. Gabe claimed that after they returned to the wreck, Tina had suddenly and unexpectedly panicked. He said she became frantic, reached out to him, and accidentally knocked his mask off his face. Gabe said that while he was struggling to clear his mask and get his bearings, Tina had simply drifted away from him and began sinking. Not knowing what else to do, Gabe said he rushed to the surface to get help. It seemed like a tragic, horrible accident, and the case was initially closed. But it was not long before the other tourists who had been on that same dive began reaching out to Tina's family in Alabama. They had witnessed something underwater that did not align with Gabe's story, and they felt a moral obligation to speak up. One of the divers explained that as they were swimming around the Yongala wreck, they saw Gabe and Tina return to the bottom. But almost immediately after they reached the wreck, the diver saw Gabe grab Tina and pull her into a tight, powerful bear hug. In the diving world, there is virtually no reason to grab another diver in that manner unless you are attempting a rescue. But the witness stated that this did not look like a rescue at all. It looked like Gabe was actively restraining Tina, holding her tightly while she struggled. After a few moments, the witness saw Gabe let go of Tina. As soon as he released her, Tina's body went completely limp and she began to sink rapidly to the ocean floor. Instead of swimming down to grab her, Gabe immediately swam toward the surface. This shocking new testimony prompted Australian authorities to reopen the case and officially charge Gabe Watson with murder. Prosecutors argued that Gabe had planned the crime and that he had deliberately turned off Tina's oxygen supply underwater and held her in a bear hug until she lost consciousness, ensuring she could not turn her air back on. Gabe, however, maintained his innocence, claiming that he had only tried to help her when she panicked and that he was simply unable to save her. Ultimately, Gabe avoided a murder trial in Australia by pleading guilty to a lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter, for which he served 18 months in an Australian prison. After his release and return to the United States, prosecutors in Alabama attempted to try him for capital murder, arguing that the plot had been formulated in Alabama before the trip. However, due to a lack of sufficient physical evidence, a judge eventually dismissed the case. To this day, one of the most chilling aspects of this case is an underwater photograph that was taken by one of the other divers on the trip. The diver had been taking a photo of their own dive partner, but when the film was later developed, there, in the background of the clear blue water, was the unmistakable image of Tina's body lying lifeless on the sandy bottom, just moments after she had sunk to the ocean floor. For our final story, we have to travel back in time to the summer of 1848 to look at a case that completely changed our understanding of the human brain. It begins with a 25-year-old railroad construction foreman named Phineas Gage, who was working on the Hudson River Railroad in New York. Phineas was an expert in handling explosives, a dangerous skill he had developed while growing up and working on his family's farm in New Hampshire. But Phineas was not just a capable worker. He was also incredibly popular among the other men on the job. His co-workers and supervisors immediately took a liking to him because he was highly intelligent, energetic, charismatic, and possessed a great sense of humor. He was a natural leader who treated his men with respect. Phineas was so excited about his role that he went to a blacksmith and had a custom tamping iron made. A tamping iron is a long metal rod that is used to pack explosives. When railroad workers wanted to blast through a big rock, they would drill a deep, skinny hole in the rock, pour blasting powder inside, put a fuse inside, and then use this tamping iron to push the powder and the fuse deep into the hole inside of the rock. The blacksmith made a perfectly straight, smooth, 4-foot-long metal tamping iron. On one end was a pointed side and on the other was a blunt side. This rod weighed about 13 pounds and it was about 1.25 inches in diameter. Phineas absolutely loved this tamping iron, and he brought it with him not just to work, but basically everywhere he went. On September 3rd, 1848, Phineas and his explosives team were blasting through some rock that ran through a forest. Phineas was right up front over the blasting site, helping them prepare the explosive. After the blasting powder and fuse were put inside the drilled hole, Phineas took his tamping iron and began packing the powder and fuse deep into the rock. As Phineas was working, one of his men behind him tripped or dropped something, making a loud noise. Phineas, still holding the tamping iron inside the hole, turned his head to the right to see what had happened. As he did this, the heavy iron rod shifted slightly inside the stone hole. The metal scraped against the side of the rock, creating a tiny spark. The spark ignited the explosive inside the rock, which meant the tamping iron was basically fired like a missile out of the hole and straight into Phineas's head. It went in through his cheek, up behind his left eye, and right out of his skull. The rod shot 80 feet away, landing on the ground covered in blood and brains. It happened so quickly that Phineas just stood there upright for a second before collapsing. When Phineas hit the ground, he began having a seizure, and his co-workers rushed over. Looking at his head, they were certain there was nothing they could do but wait for him to die. All of his co-workers, who adored him, just stood there watching their boss take what they thought were his final breaths. But then the seizure stopped. Phineas lay still for a moment, and then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, his eyes fluttered open. He looked up at his men, blinked a few times, and then calmly sat up. He looked around at the frantic, pale faces of his crew and simply asked what had happened. His co-workers could not believe he was alive, let alone having a coherent conversation. They begged him to lie down, but Phineas just stood up and walked over to the railroad cart. They started the slow 1-mile journey into town, and the whole time his crew expected him to die. But instead, Phineas sat there casually. At one point, he even pulled out his logbook and carefully wrote down what time they were leaving the worksite to make sure his crew was accurately paid. When they finally reached the town, Phineas climbed out of the cart without assistance and walked into his hotel. Instead of rushing to a bed, he decided to sit in a chair on the front porch, watching the townspeople pass by while his men ran to find a doctor. When a local physician, Dr. Edward Williams, arrived at the hotel, he was stunned by the sight. Phineas was sitting calmly on the porch, covered in blood, with a massive hole in his skull, yet his eyes were focused and alert. As the doctor approached, Phineas looked at him, smiled, and famously remarked that there was plenty of business there for him. Dr. Williams helped Phineas up to his room, placed him in a bed, and did what he could to clean the wound, preparing to make the young man's final hours as comfortable as possible, believing that infection would set in and end his life. But Phineas did not die. Over the next few weeks, he did indeed battle a severe and life-threatening infection, falling into a brief coma as his body fought off the illness. But his remarkably strong constitution pulled him through. Within a couple of months, he was up and walking around, physically recovered from an injury that should have been instantly fatal. His left eye was permanently blinded and closed, but his other physical senses were completely intact, and he could hear and see perfectly out of his right eye. However, while his body had healed, the people close to Phineas quickly realized that he was no longer the same man. The damage to the frontal lobe of his brain had completely altered his personality. The polite, clever, respectful, and energetic foreman was gone. In his place was a man who seemed to have lost all social inhibitions. He became childish, highly impatient, and constantly used profanity, which was entirely unlike him. He could no longer focus on plans or hold down a job, as he would constantly change his mind and abandon tasks. Over the next few years, those extreme personality changes began to soften, and Phineas gradually regained some of his former disposition. But he never returned to railroad work. Instead, he developed an unusual, deep attachment to the very tamping iron that had caused his injury. He carried the 13-pound iron rod with him wherever he went, holding it in his lap during photos and keeping it by his bedside. 12 years after the accident, Phineas began suffering from severe epileptic seizures, which were a long-term consequence of the brain damage. In May of 1860, he passed away in California at the age of 36, with his beloved tamping iron by his side. Phineas Gage's extraordinary case became one of the most famous medical studies in history. His case provided the scientific community with some of the very first evidence that specific areas of the physical brain are directly responsible for defining human personality and behavior, forever changing the field of neuroscience. Today, his skull and his custom tamping iron are preserved and on display at the Harvard Medical School Museum. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See a source she opened her eyes inside her own coffin. Philu, a 49-year-old woman from Kazan, had collapsed at home after doctors warned her to avoid stress. Paramedics declared her dead from a heart attack, and her grieving husband rushed to arrange her funeral within 24 hours. But during the service, mourners noticed something impossible. Philu was sitting up in the casket, covered in heavy funeral makeup, staring at everyone. At first, the suspect seemed to be a tragic medical mistake. Then came the twist: she had never truly died. The shock of waking at her own funeral triggered a second heart attack. For more chilling stories like this, visit the channel and watch the full episode.